of Macedon. Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. I'll paste that together, right? We are in chapter 18, the Elephant and the Last Rivers, which is in part 3. The allied hosts moved eastward, differing inwardly, and held together only by the personality of one man. Only the lashing of Alexandros' will drove his Macedonians on, and at the eastern frontier they met the embattled strength of another dynasty, that of the Parava kings. Antagonistic to Ambi, Alexandros had pledged Ambi that his Macedonians would break the power of the Paravas. Perhaps he did not expect that any army would presume to stand in the field against the Macedonians at this stage. Certainly he reasoned that no army could do so with success, not in the face of the allied forces now under his command. But this one stood its ground in the rain across the swift flood of the river Jhelum. Among its tents appeared elephants, several hundred of them. The Macedonians had not counted on the elephants, nor could they bridge this river, rising daily in the flood. Now, the stranger by the river is supposed to have taken place by the Jhelum River, but that's, there's reasons to think that that's not the case. Among its tents appeared elephants, several hundred of them. The Macedonians had not counted on the elephants, nor could they bridge this water, rising daily in flood. It seemed to them that the real antagonists were on the torrential water and on the giant beasts. Otherwise, they estimated the Parava force to be weak, and this they made a mistake. The crossing of the Jhelum was Alexandros' last major battle, and he lost control of it. Alexandros might have waited, of course, until the rain ceased and the river dwindled to its normal channel, but he was in no mood to wait. The Macedonians went at the problem lightly, as if playing a game for stakes. They had, for once, more cavalry than they needed. Yet they had discovered that the horses would not face elephants. Much less could horses be expected to swim a river and climb a bank under the tusks of elephants. After the first survey of the situation, Alexandros, his staff, prepared to throw the cavalry across where the elephants were not. And in doing so, they remembered 3XVIIIC. They went to work on the mind of the king leader of the Parava forces. As usual, Alexandros had kept the line of march far north among the foothills of the Punjab, the 5 rivers, and the Macedonians were now on the Jhelum, where the Salt Range meets the first ridges of Kashmir. The Jhelum here runs in a narrow channel, but with great force after the rains break. The time must have been the end of May or beginning of June 326. It was, Aurelian relates, like no experience they had undergone before. Alexandros thought best to move in every direction to bewilder Porus, the Parava, and make him uncertain what to do. Splitting up his commands, he sent them under different officers to ravage the enemy's property and to look for a place where the river might be crossed. In doing so, corn was brought in from every quarter, so the Parava king might be led to think Alexandros meant to wait at the river until the rains ended and he could ford it easily. In this fashion, Parava was given to rest, for the boats sailed up and down the bank, and men were seen stuffing skins with dry hay to make floats. Whenever Parava assembled his forces at one point to defend it, he was drawn somewhere else, especially at night. He had to march with the elephants to points where the Macedonians raised the cry of Analios, and raise commotions, like my stomach that keeps rumbling and saying, "Feed me," but it has to wait. Alexandros thus gradually got him into the habit of leading his men and elephants along across the river from the noise. After doing this often, to encounter no more than battle cries, Parava stayed put in his camp. Still he kept scouts posted along the bank. When Alexandros felt satisfied that Parava's mind no longer heeded the nightly excursions, he devised a stratagem to cross. He left Crapteros at the main camp with most of the forces, where the nightly bonfires and tumults had been staged. He ordered Crapteros not to try to cross unless Parava moved or fled away from the point opposite him. If Parava takes away only a small part of the elephants, stay where you are, he advised. But if he moves off with all the elephants to go against me and leaves a portion of his other troops, then cross the river with speed. For only the elephants, said he, can hold back your horsemen. By the night selected for the crossing, Alexandros had assembled picked units commanded by Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Coenus, and Perdiccas, 18 miles up the river. Between this point and Crapteros, a cordon of sentries had been posted to pass orders along. Boats and skin rafts had been moved up over land, out of sight of the river, and concealed in brush and trees. Here, a point projects out, where the river makes a bend. It is covered by a growth of trees of every sort. Opposite lies a wooded inland, uninhabited. This island and the woods hid the movement of Alexandros' attack column that night. While the usual fire and motion was kept up by Crapteros at the camp. A heavy rain came on, and with the noise of thunder covered the clatter of arms and the movement at the point, and the orders given by the officers just before the daybreak. The wind and rain quieted down. The boats were launched opposite the island, and the horses got on the rafts. The infantry pushed off in the boats so quietly that they were not heard as they rounded the island. Alexandros himself crossed in a 30-oared galley with Seleucus and Ptolemy. They landed in silence, and Alexandros took the first horseman up the bank to cover the landing of the infantry following on. So far as the operation had been perfectly planned and carried out, Alexandros was forming his guard cavalry to advance when the first hitch occurred. They found that they had come ashore, not on the far bank, but on another island. It was a large one that had seemed to be part of the shore, but was separated from the bank by a narrow channel through which floodwater rushed. When they floundered along this arm of the river, the enemy pickets opposite observed them. Meanwhile, the attack column, debarking from boats and rafts, was piling up behind them in the darkness. They found a place where the arm of the river could be forded. Men had to plow through the torrents up to their armpits, and horses were submerged to their necks. In the gray mist of dawn, Alexandros got his horse guards to the bank at last, on ground that was no more than a sea of mud, and thereafter all the carefully laid plan broke down. They were still plodding through mud when the first enemy force appeared on their front. Alexandros sent the horse archers ahead to skirmish and investigate, only to learn that the enemy numbered no more than a couple of thousand chariots of horses. Belatedly he advanced with all his cavalry. The enemy column, either mired in the mud or unwilling to retreat, stood its ground and was decimated. Delayed by this action, uncertain of what the Parava main body was doing, Alexandros decided to push south with all his horsemen, leaving the phalanx units to follow at the run. In an hour he was far out of sight to the infantry laboring through the mud of the riverbank. So it happened that he came full upon the main strength of the Pauravas, with the only cavalry around him, and that strength was drawn up in a long line upon higher sandy ground than offered better footing. Elephants armored for battle formed the advances of the line, 200 of them, with 100-foot intervals between them. In the intervals were posted archers equipped with bows so powerful that the ends had to be rested on the ground to discharge an arrow. Javelin and swordsman supported the archers. Unable to risk his horse against such a line, Alexandros halted and waited. There was no sign of Craterus, who had obeyed orders in remaining in the camps across the river, since the Parava king had seen fit to leave some elephants there with a holding force. After hours, the tired Apaspists and the shieldmen of the phalanx jogged up. Alexandros had to wait for the infantry to gain breath and formation. No sooner had they deployed than he swung his mass of cavalry out to the right flank in the customary Macedonian maneuver to his right. He had with him now his new horse archers, the fine Bactrian and Scythian cavalry. With this wealth of power, he experimented brilliantly, feigning to retreat with his companions, while the newer units made a wide circle to take the lighter Indian cavalry in the rear when it pressed after Alexandros. As usual, in close combat, he was riding the aged Bucephalus. And suddenly Bucephalus went down, without a wound on him. The day's straining through the mud had overtaxed the old horse, which died under Alexandros. Outmaneuvered and penned in on two sides by the Macedonian horse, the Indian cavalry, crowding together, resisted savagely. Alexandros plunged into this action on a fresh mount, paying no further attention to the phalanx that he had left to face the elephants and the gigantic bows, which had the power of small engines. Obediently, the Macedonian phalanx, some 6,000 strong, was advancing as it had always done at this turn in the battle, led by Seleucus and Perdiccas, who had been given no plan for dealing with the elephants, and the giant beast advanced to meet them. How the phalanx managed to stand its ground is unknown, but it did stand and hold the elephants. This action was unlike anything experienced before. Arrian explains critically. Wherever the elephants rushed, they broke into the phalanx itself of the Macedonians, dense as it was. In some way, the Macedonian infantry managed to stop the line of elephants and turn it. Perhaps they were able to kill off the Mahouts. By now, all the Macedonian cavalry had been collected in one mass, not by any command of Alexandros's, but by being thrown together by the effect of the combat itself. The elephants, being now cooped up with the Parava horse, injured their own people as much as their enemies in their wheeling and rushing about, for most of them no longer kept place in the battle on account of their suffering or being deprived of their keepers. But even when wearied and unable to charge, they backed slowly, facing the foe like ships backing water, only giving out a shrill piping sound. All the elephants which were not killed there were captured. In this incoherent slaughter, Alexandros finally made his way around the infantry and brought them into some kind of line by an order to lock their shields together. Then Craterus's forces, having crossed the river at last, appeared on the scene. These fresh troops took up the pursuit of the surviving enemy. Alexandros's command was too exhausted to move. After that day, the Macedonian infantry was never the same. The Parava king had been almost the last to withdraw on his war elephant, both men and beast badly wounded. Alexandros had noticed him and sent officers of Raja Ampi's command after him to urge him to surrender. This the Indian chieftain refused to do until one of his own officers brought him a personal message from Alexandros. Then he consented to leave his elephant and await Alexandros. The Macedonian came up and dismounted before speaking, struck by the size and bearing of the Parava. The wounded man was given a drink and stepped forward of his own accord to Alexandros. In what way do you wish to be treated? The conqueror asked. The Paurava seemed indifferent to what was said. As a king, he replied, yes, but what else do you wish? All else is included in that. So legend gives the speech between the kings, and legend has preserved it in many languages of Asia. Pleased with the encounter, Alexandros gives full amnesty to the Pauravas and their subjects, and he ordered 2 cities to be built by the bloodied sands of the Jalam, one to be named Nika'a, victory, and the other Basathala, because the war horse, which had been his companion for 17 years, was buried there. 17 years is a particular 17 is a particular number that's important in a lot of theology. 17 of 5 daily prayers, 17 every 17 years, a particular group wants to offer 22, you know what I'm saying? The crossing of the Jetlam left its mark upon single-minded Seleucus, who became convinced then and there of the necessity for elephant power. In a few years, when he had made himself king of Western Asia, he collected elephants as assiduously as Ptolemy collected gems and women, willingly bartering a province for a fine herd. But the scars left upon the Macedonian veterans at the Jalam could not be eradicated by celebration. By the building of still more cities are the gifts of new treasures. The last army mutinied at the 5th river. This was the Beas, the last of the 5 rivers of the Punjab. From the Jalam to the Beas, the Macedonians had mastered 38 hill towns. They had marched through the rains, while Alexandros kept stubbornly to the fringe of the mountains of Kashmir. They had 1,200 wounded at the storming of the Wagon fortress of Sangala. They had passed through the lands of northern India. Neither the Pauravas nor Raja Ambi's people knew what lay beyond. Across this last river, the Macedonians could see other elephants and the ever-rising wall of the Himalayas. Ahead, the surveyors hinted stretched unknown lands of a river called the Ganges, mightier than the Indus or the Nile. The Macedonian soldiery consulted in groups among the tents at the Beas and agreed to march in only one direction, towards home. And my final note that I'm going to say, The Stranger by the River by Paul Twitchell's an Eckankar book. And I know that, for example, is representative. That's why but I was reminded.